In summary,
like he still wants to be a minority.
Can be bad, but also can be good. Because he participates in the competition, right?
You're listening to Sploosh. In this episode, Saara and I, Hao Yang, interview Mysara and Kristian, co-editors of Brownness, Redacted, an anthology published by Ethos Books in 2022. Brownness, Redacted, Reflecting on Race in Singapore, is an anthology that responds to, expands on, and questions what we think we know about the lived experiences of minority-raised people in Singapore. What is unique about it is that it features a combination of essays, academic works, poems, and short stories by brown individuals. Ultimately, the anthology is not a revolutionary call to action or a sustained series of think pieces leveled at the majority race or the status quo. At its core, it is a moving and expressive work of solidarity and vulnerability. Now, as a Chinese man, I was at first rather unsure if I should be participating in this interview for two reasons. First, I did not want to take up space, and second, I was afraid I would be unable to fully empathize and end up saying things that were politically incorrect or even microaggressions. After all, identity politics produces tense environments often unconducive for meaningful conversation conducted in good faith. Nonetheless, the conversation we had turned out to be incredibly nuanced and thoughtful, and I really learned so much from listening to Mysara, Kristian, and Saara share their thoughts and experiences as brown individuals. One of the most insightful moments for me was when we were discussing the topic of brown masculinity, and we all eventually agreed that it should be a matter left for the brown community to sort out by themselves, and that the topic itself being debated by non-brown individuals like me betrayed a kind of haughty paternalism. I hope you find the conversation as nourishing as I did, and that we continue having such conversations with one another, to amplify voices that generally go unheard, and to let them tell their own stories.
So I think we'll start by reading their bios. So Kristian-Marc James Paul, who goes by he, him, his, is an activist and writer. He is a member of climate justice collective SG Climate Rally. Apart from his work in climate activism, Kristian also facilitates intergroup dialogues, partnering with organizations like AWARE to run community discussions on masculinity and male allyship. He was also a contributing author for White, Behind Mental Health Stigma, 2020, an anthology on mental health in Singapore.
And Mysara is a Singaporean creative, writer, and researcher. With a background in communications and journalism, she was previously a journalist and documentary producer, and is currently pursuing her master's with the Malay Studies department in NUS. Her current research looks at the formation of identity through state narratives of nation building that cuts across race, class, and gender. Her works, based on personal experiences and research, explore and reimagine dominant narratives through different mediums. Working on the intersections of art and academia, she also explores the politics of space and power structures in the process of narrative making. So I think before we even start, right, perhaps both of you could share about how you identify in terms of race in Singapore, right? Because, I mean, the brown community is a huge community in Singapore, and we can't say that these two co-editors can speak for every single brown person in Singapore. So I think it'd be good to have you guys just introduce yourselves a bit to begin.
So what's my race is, I guess, the question. But no, I mean, I think that is the crux of what I try and explore, at least in my parts in the Brownness Haram script. I think it's interesting. So my race on my IC is Indian. My dad is Indian. But my mom is like Malay. She's got a bit of like Eurasian blood also, and I think that has been something that I have negotiated my whole life, because even though I am still close to my dad, my parents got divorced when I was fairly young, and so my mom and my grandma, so my maternal grandma, raised me, and so I resonate a lot with like that side of my family, and so I guess I would sort of say that I am like more Malay than I am like Indian, but then that's also like interesting because I've had experiences where I maybe am not necessarily like Malay enough for specific communities, national service. I was in civil defense, which is there are a lot primarily Malay Muslim individuals, and yeah, I think experience sort of also then being like a bit like, I'm not like really like sort of I don't really fit in there also. So that is my answer to a seemingly short question, but yeah, I don't think there is a very like easy answer.
I guess if you want to look through the eyes of the state, in my identity card it actually says others. So my dad is Arab. His father is Arab. His mom is Chinese. But his family is very much Malay. Like we've assimilated into the Malay community. We speak Malay. We don't speak Arabic. Which is funny because on the birth certificate, sometimes they'll have your dialect or your father's dialect and it says Arabic, and my dad doesn't speak a word of Arabic. My mom is Malay, right? So I think like a lot of like mixed kids, you tend to kind of like maybe identify with one race, and because my mom is a stay-at-home mom and I spend a lot of time with my mom when my dad works, I see myself as a Malay woman. I don't see myself as Arab because I don't know anything about the culture. I grew up with a Malay culture. I speak Malay. I don't speak Arabic, so I identify myself as a Malay woman. Yeah.
I think another question that maybe audiences would have, the average Singaporean, is how we define brown in Brownness Redacted, because this is a term that I don't think many Singaporeans are familiar with since we grew up with CMIO, and even for westernized Singaporean youths, right? They just think in terms of black or white. So what does brown mean in the Singaporean context?
I think, I don't know. I think at least for me, as much as like the book is about brownness, for me it's also, I think, almost not, productive or fruitful to kind of try and find an answer to what exactly is brownness. Which is also why I think we wanted to do the anthology in the first place, because I guess Brownness Haram, the script, was very much about our experiences, very particular experiences with our race, but then we also realized that so many other people have other experiences with their race in I think something that you alluded to, like in a Chinese majority country. So I guess if you really want to really kind of nail it down, I think it is definitely sort of, I guess kind of like the non-Chinese, non-white experience. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a comprehensive answer to brownness, and I hope I think one of our aims was to ensure that the search for brownness is more important than the answer to what brownness is, I think.
I think it's also looking at what the status quo is, right, and who upholds the status quo. Because I think one of the things that we look at also is critiquing, this idea of the model minority, right? I think in the play I also explore this idea of your model Malay woman, who essentially is accepted by the state. So, essentially I think, we talk about brownness, it's like who does not have that power to decide what is the status quo or not.
Yeah, I think if anything it is about, brownness is defined more by the people in power than us. Right? We are made to feel othered, or we are made to feel our race because we are alienated by Chinese people. When people speak Mandarin in the workplace or whatever and we don't understand a word, that is how they define brownness. So if anything, actually it's not really us defining it. It's like everyone else who sort of defines it for us through the alienation.
So I think that's different, ethnicities or, talk about social class in brownness, but there's always that small little thing that bind us, right? When you're the maybe only brown person, or maybe there's you and one other brown person in the office and they start speaking in Mandarin, you share that look, and I think every brown person knows what that look is, right, when you exchange it. So it's also moments like this where it binds all of us together.
Yeah, I think you're very right in saying that it's not really something that is, but it's something that is not, right? That results as the result of an alienation from what the majority group is. So, I read your book, obviously. And I thought it was really interesting. It's not like any other sort of anthology or collection I've read before, right? Because there are short stories, there's like non-fiction, there's academic essays, from different, NTU professors, from, like graduate students, but there's also poetry, there's, stories from young children. So I guess when you set out putting together this anthology, what was it that you were really hoping to achieve with it?
I think, I think one thing was for sure when we discussed about making the book was that we didn't want it to just be, like academic pieces or essays, where people feel like they have to intellectualize this idea of like talking about race in Singapore, which I think has been going on for like quite a while. Which is why we had that mix of academic essays and poetry. So we wanted to give people that space to be able to express themselves in a way that they want to, and also I think in a sense, validate, I think, what we've been through as brown people in this country, and you don't feel like you have to be super articulate or like you use academic jargon to talk about race, essentially your emotions is valid, and I think that's what we also wanted to kind of achieve, and I think we could only have done that if we kind of had variety in terms of the mediums of submissions that we had.
It's like not having to argue for your existence or identity, but simply just expressing
yourself.
Yeah, no, I think Hao Yang, what you said was exactly right, and actually my impulse, because sometimes I always get, I'm always not very good with answering sort of like what do you want to achieve or like who your target audience is. I think those questions always don't necessarily factor into like at least how I create work. For me, at least, what is important is actually just the public expression, the public utterance, like that in and of itself is valuable. There doesn't necessarily need to be any sort of like a thesis statement or like a solution to it, right? It is really just through the expressing and through the putting it out in the world that you get something, and people can gain something from that also.
And I thought it was quite effective in, sort of like speaking to the experiences that, I've had in Singapore. Obviously, like you said, there's no one way to be brown. There's no one thing that it means, and there's no such thing as a unified community. But, like reading through the essays and the stories and the poems, there were some experiences that I couldn't relate to, but there were some that I could. There were some things I read, I said, oh wow, that exact thing has happened to me, someone has said that to my face. And I guess like that's sort of the power of the personal anecdotes and the creative writing. But at the same time, we have academic essays that sort of help to formalize and validate the experiences that you've been having, because I think at times it can be, and I think this is something that's been touched on in the book as well, when you have this idea of racial harmony being a very fragile construct, then every time you try and speak up against it, then it's sort of like perceived as being a threat to this very fragile racial harmony that we've been working so hard to keep intact. So sometimes when you think about the experiences that you've had, or instances of racism or alienation that you faced, it can be easy to doubt yourself and think, oh, maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. So then when you actually read, like academic writing that says, this is all the data and the facts and logics to support that this is a problem, that can also be something that's very validating, So I think putting this like range of different mediums into one collection really made it very effective. So anyway, it's been a while since this book has come out. Since then, how do you think it's been received?
What are the people saying?
What have people said to you about it?
What are the masses saying?
We should have done the poll, no, I'm just kidding. I think the responses has been interesting. Of course, I think that from one book we couldn't have like invited everyone we wanted to, so we still feel that there are voices that are not there, but I think we've kind of like said from the start that it's not an encyclopedia, right? I think one of the most like interesting like response I've gotten was I gave a copy to my good friend who's Chinese Indonesian in Jakarta, and he shared on his Instagram that, even though, we're talking about brownness in relation to Singapore, these are universal themes that him as, a minority in his country can relate. Yeah, right? So I think that was very heartwarming to hear, and when I caught up with him, we had a very interesting conversation about how he felt about the book, So I think that was something quite nice to hear. Yeah.
Christian? Nothing? Oh. Well, actually,
no one has come to you and said, hey, I read the book you edited, I really liked it, or I really hated it, or anything?
The only thing that I would say is, I think this is more like the formal element of the book in terms of things like pacing and whether or not it was too long, or whether or not I think those things are things that I've heard a lot about. I think in general, I think people have been quite affirming of the book, and if anything sort of what it represents, right? Not necessarily the content. That's not saying that the content isn't good, but I guess just sort of the intention behind the book. But beyond that, I think I've been also interested in just hearing kind of the more formal elements, right? At the end of the day, we are sort of the editors, right? So I think hearing notes on editing have also been interesting, and I've welcomed that for sure.
what Mysara said just now about her Chinese Indonesian friend resonating with the piece also resonated with me myself, because quite obviously I'm Chinese, so it's hard for me to relate to the brown experience, right? But then the pieces which I could still relate to, perhaps not in its entirety, I think I remember reading Nor's piece. Then there was this line that said, the fact that you exist shows that people have thought you're beautiful, and I think many of your ancestors have thought you were beautiful. And that just resonated with me a lot, because I also have parts of my identity which I don't think are that cohere that well with the dominant Chinese straight man's identity, So there are also parts which I can still resonate with. And also I think there was another text, especially national service, because I'm currently serving national service, right? And there was this text about how there's always this token Malay colonel, and I'm like, yeah, exactly. No one else in BMT there was that Malay colonel, and he's still there right now. So
it's true.
I'm like, yep, it is true.
Yeah, for sure. I think that was the hope, right? I think the hope wasn't necessarily this goes into target audience, but it wasn't necessarily oh, it's only meant for brown people, or sure, obviously yes, that there is solidarity there that I think you just cannot necessarily sort of really sort of define and articulate, but that exists through this, and that we hope that people experience. But like you said, it is also right. I think the idea of being marginalized is something that happens for different kinds of identities also, right? It's not just about race. So thanks for sharing.
Something else that's also quite surprising is you chose quite a lot of writing by young writers whom no one would have heard of. What was the intention behind that? Why not feature more established writers for creative writing?
I would also say are they not known outside the brown community? And that's the thing about, I guess, Singapore scene. Sometimes we tend to focus, on the same group of people, and then we assume there's no other people in the community who can do great work as well. Which is why we wanted to do an anthology, because we didn't want to fixate this idea of talking about race to us and some of the more senior writers that everyone knows, right? Yeah, so I think that would be my question back to you. Why do we assume that these people are new when actually some of them have been in the art scene for quite a while, or literary scene for quite a while. So I think it's ready to break this status quo that when we talk about race, we only need to we can only think about these few people.
I think it was, I don't know if that's the nature of just Singapore, but everyone sort of, not everyone knows everyone lah, but you always have the few people in your head, right? You think of the thought leaders that
go back to the model minority.
Exactly. And I think we definitely wanted to resist that, but also I think we wanted to, especially with the younger writers, because we did do the open call to try and get people who are 17 and below. I think that was really just because, like Mysara said, we just wanted to ensure that as many people as possible had the space to talk about it, because these experiences are as real as the experiences that like your more established people have faced, right? If anything, it is maybe a bit more like, I don't know, like raw or pure, and if anything, that in and of itself, like I think has a message that like, I remember I personally, when I was reading some of these entries and just being like some of these people are like what, 13, 15-year-olds, right? And the way that they can so clearly understand like alienation and what it means to be brown, right? To be able to put that into words so clearly shows, I think, just a level of familiarity that is just so sad, right? That you have to be like 13 or 15 and already know this so intimately. I think in and of itself is, I think an interesting thing that we hope, or I hope that readers also reflect on.
Yeah, I think it's also to break away from this idea that you have to be established or you have to have like a degree or master's degree to be able to talk about these things. And yeah, I think that rawness from these very young like writers also kind of help break that. Yeah.
What are your favorite pieces in the anthology? If you had to pick
I don't
one
play
or a
favorites,
couple.
no.
Maybe something that particularly stuck out to you.
I know our other editor likes Ashwin's piece. What's Ashwin's piece called?
Is
it? Ashwin, I think, was like a 10-year-old one.
The one that he ended with, like...
In summary...
Like he still wants to be a minority.
Can be bad, but also can be good. Because in the competition, right?
I think I also said that's my favorite.
Very sweet, yeah.
But I feel like that kinds of resonates with a lot of like brown people. We just don't say it out loud, you know, like when you have moments where, like, you know, when it's Hari Raya or Deepavali, you see like, I like my culture, you know, I wouldn't trade it to be like a majority, you know. Yeah, so I think that was one of my favorites, actually. Yeah. Because I feel like he says things that adults won't say, you know, because even if you think you're radical, you're still politically correct. And he was like, I'm just going to say it, you know. I love that,
Yeah. I know our other editor also like talks about just like, I mean, it's just going back to the idea of like purity, and so like it is really sort of like point counterpoint, like it's really like so also reflective of the kind of way we are conditioned to like think, which I think is just interesting. But it is so like it is like so innocent, I think. I don't know whether, I mean, I really liked the interview with Ash the rapper. Ash is someone who lives in like the rental flat community, and I think that like the idea of like carcerality, right, or being of prison, I think was very interesting. And I think just formally, just because it's an interview, I think it was quite different from the rest of the pieces. So at least for me, that felt like it's nice to like spice things up, I guess.
I think it was I won't say favorite, but like I'm really glad we had the pieces from the migrant workers as well, especially diary entries, because these are things that you won't hear or people don't bother to like seek out in that sense, right? And I thought it was very important that like we brought that in, especially with whatever has been going around for the past 2 years and even recently, I think that is very important, because also I think it breaks away from this idea that when we talk about race, it's Singaporeans only, right? Yeah, I think we needed that, because I think that is a piece that even brown Singaporeans need to kind of like reflect on themselves. And I travel to Indonesia quite a bit, and in certain parts, like let's say Yogyakarta, when you land, like once you reach the airport, there'll be this counter, and that counter is specifically for migrant workers, domestic helpers, right? And it's basically if you come back and you've been abused, you can go straight there, right? And because they just like kind of shifted the airport, so that was the first time I saw it like this year since COVID, and I was like, wow. And I spoke to the lady there, and she was telling me, because they have no other outlets, right? And that was why they needed that. And of course, we have like quite a number of like domestic helpers here in Singapore, a lot of like unspoken cases. So, those pieces were like very important, I think.
So what surprised you the most about the works that you received for the open call? Or what surprised you the least?
I mean, I think like what I said, I think what surprised me the least and the most, right, is that just like how yeah, how sad the stories were, I guess. A lot of them were really like, oh my god. I mean, like, really breaks my heart, I guess. Like, 13, 15-year-olds or 16-year-olds or so, to be able to write so intimately about this thing, right? It's just so like, yeah, man, what are we doing? Yeah, I think at least for me. But also just like, yeah, these people are damn good writers, man. I was really like, I was also just having like an existential moment, like, what was I doing when I was 15? Really, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me also is how many people would want to get their voices heard. Because I think we had to reject some of the open call pieces because they were above the like age limit also, right? But the stories were of course like important and valid. And I think even though we can say, oh, a lot of people are talking on it on social media and stuff, there's never really been, a lot of platforms for minority people to just like write down their experiences or express it in the way that they want. Yeah. You can say that, like you can just do it, you can just create art, but it's not really that easy. Yeah.
I think definitely like along the lines, which is not necessarily related to the open call, but like just this idea of how do you like edit pieces that are so like visceral? How do you edit like, I guess like literally someone's lived experience, right? Still sort of trying to hold on to your editor head of being like thinking of like, I don't know, like, what is like dramatic, or sort of thinking about where it fits in the whole, like anthology, and so then thinking about like the kind of purpose it has to serve, which all seem like such like logistical and like utilitarian things to think about. And then when you put that like, and when you have to think about it, when you are confronted with, I guess, these very visceral experiences, it's also like, I think that at least for me, I think it was interesting sort of negotiating that, I think.
I think Mysara alluded just now to how it was important for these minority voices to be able to be featured on a page, right? I mean, it's essentially getting a foot in an institution, right? Because the publishing industry, I mean, Singlit, Singapore literature, is so dominated by not just Anglophone, right, but also Chinese, English writers. So what do you think is the importance of brown representation in writing in Singapore?
I mean, other than the usual, breaking away from the like the dominant narratives that we have is also, I think brown writers have this. We tend to also like look back at like history, because a lot of our history is often like forgotten. So I would like to like give a shout out to like Puja Nancy for featuring a lot of the like veteran Malay women writers at last year's like Singapore Writers Festival, because it breaks away from this idea that Malay women are just sitting at home, we're not educated and things like that. But also I think along the way I've realized that we need to continuously have this representation, because I think sometimes even when you've done a lot, it gets, buried underneath, right? You're either kind of seen as like the angry brown person, or people, might kind of tag on you because it makes them look good, diversity. But essentially, like, you're still invisible in many ways, right? So this continuous, effort of like representing or passing the baton, as I would like to like say it, to like, I think the younger, community. Because I guess sometimes people in the scene or like, activists like to kind of like hold on to their like legacy, but I think it's important to like hand it over so that it continues, right? I don't know if I should share this analogy, but like, should I?
You say it like that.
I mean, within the three of us, I'm the only like Malay woman in the book, right? And I think it's been very interesting to see how people react. So like, I like to make fun of like Yan and Chris, because sometimes, like Chinese men who happen to know them, happen to be same college from them, will be like, oh, have you read this book? And then I was like, yeah, I've read that book. And then, have you seen the play? I'm like, not really, because I was in that play, right? So this, sometimes people consume, it's not just important to consume like media from brown people, but to also, I think, make the effort to know who they are. right? So that it's not just, oh, we do have enough brown writers, but we question them, they can't name names. Yeah.
Otherwise,
Yeah.
just like token representation.
Yes, it's token representation, right? Yeah. So it's not just, oh, I know about this book, so I'm an ally.
Yeah.
But then you don't really
Having it on your bookshelf,
Yeah,
in the back
on
of
the
a Zoom
bookshelf.
call.
Yeah, yes, you know, but actually who wrote it, who edited it, you
Yeah.
can't tell. Yeah. So I think that's also like, I think important. Yeah.
I've seen you talk about it on your Twitter.
Yes, it's just it's just funny to me. I'm like, I don't think it's malicious. It's definitely not malicious, but it's also a very good representative of how I think it's also a gender issue, right? How I think
exactly.
it's a community see brown women, right? We're like often at the sidelines and forgotten, right? Or like when we write, people think we're angry or we're attacking, but that's not it. Yeah.
And so, since both of you are writers, right? Could you share a bit more about your experience in the industry or in the scene, and like what advice you would have for like aspiring brown writers listening to this?
My God, are we? You're more in the scene than me, right, Sarah? You're so
Share
popular
your
on
wisdom.
like social media.
I feel
and
like
things
there's a
that.
word. The imposter syndrome.
Imposter syndrome.
I think a lot of my writings, was based actually like I mean, not just like I think my experience as a Singaporean Malay woman, but a lot of it also came from when I was working in the newsroom. I think that also gave me like a lot of access to understanding how things are, and I think like I know sometimes when you're a minority, it feels like you have to compete with everyone because the space for you is so small.
Yeah.
But that's not the case. I mean, Brownness came from a collaboration between me and Chris, right? We're like, let's just like collaborate, and I think it led to a lot of like really cool things for us together, but also us individually. Each of us have our own projects, which is really cool, and I think that's that. Like, I think one advice is like, don't be afraid to collaborate. Don't feel like you have to compete with other minority people for a spot.
Yeah.
That's what I guess people want you to think, but there's always space for you, yeah.
Yeah, I think I would echo that. I think this is also just going back to what you were saying, Mysara, about like passing the baton. I guess my sort of uncharitable take is, again, I don't know if it's because of the nature of how small sort of the scene is, but like it ends up sometimes sort of like unwittingly being like driven or shaped by like personalities, right? As opposed to like a community. And so then you have like specific people who hold a lot of sort of like clout or power and influence, and like maybe don't necessarily know sort of when to like let other people speak. So I think actually a good way to directly challenge that, like you said, is to collaborate, is to ensure that maybe there isn't necessarily need to sort of actively challenge this like, like a hegemonic voice or whatever, but it is about just actually trying to build a community and let that flourish, as opposed to trying to be like competitive. I think, I can speak for myself and say that like I think I am still like obviously learning how to write. I don't think I know how to write, but I am also just like very open, and I think there are people out there, obviously there are some people who maybe like won't, but like I think there are people out there who like I think like want to help or are excited to read what young people or younger people, I guess I am old now, but like like younger people, what they're saying, I think that to me is, at least for me personally, I'd be excited to read what other people like are saying, and if they like are looking for thoughts or whatever, that to me is exciting for me, at least right now. Like I'm very happy to like help out or whatever, and I'm sure there are other people also who want to do that.
Well, you can edit this part out later. But I just wanted to say, one of my friends from primary school is in your book, and and I remember she was super excited about it, when I guess she got the news that she was going to be published, and she was like telling everyone, hey guys, I got published in this book.
Nice.
And then I saw the book at SWF last year in the bookshop, and then I took out her poem and I took a picture, I sent it to her, and I was like, oh my god, I found your book. Which was really, really exciting to me. And the thing that, and so I just wanted to say, I thought it was like super cool that in your book she got a platform to be published, especially since she's been writing about issues of her identity and like the way she understands whatever, like for years and years now. But anyway, if you would
Wait, I have
like...
stuff to say though.
Oh, you do?
No, but like, I agree that affirmation is so important for young writers because I think what you guys are doing is really like trying to lift the gate, because the literary community is so gate-kept, right, sometimes, and it's like, you guys just want to let these people know that their voices deserve to be heard as well, and their writing is good as well. I think that's really precious because I think writers especially, maybe they start writing at a young age, but then if they don't get affirmation, then they give up eventually. And I think this larger struggle perhaps for minority writers who won't even get equal chances to be published. So I think that's what's even more precious about this anthology. And I think also because we're talking about advice, right, for young brown writers and stuff, because I have this friend of mine who is queer and brown, and he told me that he has this struggle that back in school he would always feel the need to be a model for his community, to project the image of excellence on behalf of his community, and but then he shared with me that he's trying to unlearn that. So I think that's something I can't say for the brown community, but I hope that's something people can take away, that they don't have to feel like they are the vanguard of their own community, just be the vanguard of yourself, just do the best you can,
I think that's something that I think every brown person definitely can relate. You have to be successful because you feel like if you're not, then people will blame it on your community, right? And that's why a lot of us burn out because we don't really get to rest, because when you rest, you're a lazy Malay, So I think I'm turning 30 this year, so I feel like it took me a long time to be able to be like, I don't really want to be the high achieving Malay woman anymore, and that's fine, right? I think I want to define what success looks like, in my own terms. And if it doesn't match up to the majority, I really don't care. So I think that's also very important to set your pace. At the end of the day, you also come to realize that you depend on your community to help you pave that way, because you also meet people from the majority like, oh, it's great, let's use you because you're like a template for diversity, but when it comes to where resources are, you're often excluded. So I think going like, okay, I don't want to do this anymore, I don't want to be the high achieving Malay, I don't be praised by the majority, that is, I think, a sign of a step forward actually.
I think sort of similar to what the both of you are saying, another sort of aspect of this also is what we've discussed, and I know Mysara has brought this up quite a few times also, just sort of the fear or the worry that we're now artists / writers who write about race and nothing else, that is our thing now. Which is also I think something that sort of disproportionately affects minority people, right? You suddenly think oh, I guess because they are a minority person, they should or can talk about race, and that's it, right? You label them as someone who talks about race as opposed to just a writer, period. So that's definitely something that I think is also something else that, speaking to definitely younger people who are beginning to write or who are beginning to think about things, would really just be to I think as much as the pressure is there, I think it is a valid fear, right? I definitely sometimes still struggle with what do I do with my voice, or what should I say? But obviously it is damn tiring also, right? And so I think for young writers especially, or young artists, is really just to create as much as you can and create different things. Because I don't know, I feel I'm not saying it's inevitable, but I think for younger people, I think the exploration is something that you should really do, as opposed to 30-year-old people who this is it. We're race thought leaders for the rest of our lives.
I think what Chris said is true, right? We don't want to be boxed into this. Oh, okay, Chris and Mysara, they're only gonna do race. No, I want to write maybe something I want to write a romance novel, maybe without the race element, right? And that should be perfectly fine. But I think it's a progression. I think something that both of us eventually have to learn to kind of take a step back as well, so that we can move on to other things that we want to explore as well.
Is there any one thing that you hope that non-brown readers will take away from reading your book? I know earlier you mentioned, you don't have a target audience or anything like that. But, like someone like Hao Yang read your book, what is one thing you hope that he would glean from it? Something that you hope maybe he'll understand now.
How about not Hao Yang? How's kind of enlightened one? I mean, how about the average Chinese person on the street?
Nice.
I'm not gonna say like enlightened or not enlightened because I feel like even within more progressive circles, race is still very like
Yeah, of
a
course.
topic that a lot of majorities still don't understand, right? That's why a lot of raw writers are still talking about intersectionality because we don't really see it in these kind of spaces. Very simply, I think when a brown person is talking about race-related issues, it's not a threat to you. Like, we're not threats to you. We're not here to like take away your privilege or like, demand that, you give everything to us. I think acknowledging that your race helps you get where you are now.
Yeah.
It's not something that like, immediately erases your effort or something like that. Yeah, and I'm not gonna go into like, we want you to like this and that. But I think that is a step that is feel like I would like to still see more people in the majority community, like Chinese people, like acknowledge whether you see yourself as like enlightened or not. Just acknowledging that helps a lot also. Yeah, because you can read 10 books of race, but if you don't want to acknowledge it, if you don't want to do the work within yourself, as cliche as it sounds, then I feel like there's really no point in talking about like progression in that sense, right? Because it's also acknowledging your own privilege.
No, I totally agree with that because acknowledging your privilege is really so important because to kind of combat the narrative that where you are in life is simply due to effort, because I mean this cuts across race and class because there's so many factors that we can't control when we are the minority, whether you are you live in like rental estates or whether you're brown. Like these are factors you can't control but which have impeded your ability to achieve in life, and simply getting that acknowledgement of privilege from the majority is, I think it's comforting. I mean, for me, even if it doesn't achieve any kind of societal change, that comforting effect still matters to me. I mean, but beyond acknowledging privilege, is there anything else that like majority can do?
I think I would like to throw that question back to the majority because a lot of times we're asked like, what should we do, right? We're expected to come up with a solution, even though we pretty much highlight like, hey, these are structural issues, these are issues from the community itself. But there's this sort of like, okay, we're still expecting you to tell us what to do. And that's a form of privilege, right? Like I think it's essentially making the work to come up with the solutions. We're not asking you to talk on our behalf, but look, at the end of the day, it's like someone causing harm, and then at the end of the day you still expect the victim to come up with solutions, right? When the effort should be done by the person holding the status quo, or the person who has the power to kind of make the policies or make the change, which is why I think it's not like there's no one answer to like what can we do, like are we talking about individuals, are we talking about organizations, are we talking more in like a government like status kind of thing. But essentially I think just making the effort, right, to be like looking at like, I guess maybe an example could be like the organizations that you guys are in, and just like, do we have enough minority representation? And even like, are the minority representations that we have are the ones that we are comfortable with, right? Are we still using certain people in the community to maintain status quo, right? Because I think when you have a minority for the sake of being for the sake of them, because they are minorities, then it just becomes tokenism, and we still see that a lot. So I think taking the works to dismantle structures that you've already upheld over the years, I think that would be a great step, right? I think I wouldn't say that the guidelines or like guidance in how to create solutions is not that, it's like whether you make the effort or not, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think at least in terms of like what I hope people like, two things. I think number one, like what I hope people like at least take away is that they understand that like like race doesn't sort of exist on its own, right? Like I think something that we write in introduction is that like no one entry is just exclusively about race, right? Like it cuts across different things. Like race or racism manifests in very specific ways because of the other identities you hold on to. And I guess we hope that sort of comes through the book to understand that like, yeah, if you want to be anti-racist, you also, you know, have to be someone who like thinks about like toxic masculinity or things about how like racism shows up in gendered ways. I think the other thing, and thinking about like solutions or like, you know, like which is definitely a question that like, yeah, I guess people ask definitely, right? Like what can we do? Yeah, I always sort of like, I think a lot about, you know, I think when we think about like sort of individual action, I always sort of get a bit kind of like yeah, is there like meaning, is there value in asking that question? Because it's like, I don't want to be like, call out casual racism, you know? That's so like that's so lame. Like really, like obviously yes, yeah, you should, but also it's like, is that going to, you know, suddenly mean that like our ethnic integration policy is going to disappear? Is that going to ensure that like SAP schools are going to disappear? No. So I think when it comes to like what solutions you can do, I think it is really thinking about how is race like upheld here, and like who like benefits from like I think these structures being upheld, and knowing that as an individual what you can conceivably try to do is to actively challenge then like the specific like sort of political powers that like uphold these things, because I think the only way is to really go to the source line, to like really think about like actively challenging the powers that be, because or not the structures aren't going to come down. You know, you can call out casual racism all you like, but these things still exist. Yeah.
I think also like understand that it's a continuous work, you know, like it's not something like what Chris said, like, oh, I called out this uncle for being racist, I'm good, I'm an ally, right? Or I read Brownness Redacted, yes, you know, I've done my one reading. No, it's a continuous effort. Whether it's relooking at your own self or structures, it's not something that's gonna stop.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the thing, right? Sometimes people assume that, oh, we've done enough, but actually like there's more to be done. Yeah. So I think once you have this mentality that, hey, you know, oh, you know, like sometimes you have like Chinese people will be like, oh, like, you know, they hear incidents of racism and they're like, oh, so tiring. So sad, so tiring. They use the word tiring. Like, okay, but it's even more tiring for us to have to like go through that, right? And also understand that, you know, at the end of the day, you get to step away, right? You get to step away and like block the noise. We can't like you know, step away from identity and like, oh, we don't, I'm too tired to face racism today, maybe tomorrow. No, we don't get to do that. So I think, you know, just understanding that, you know, it is going to be a continuous effort. If you're an ally, you need to understand that it is a continuous effort, right? And it's an effort that we do expect from you. We're not gonna like sugarcoat it and like try and be nice all the time. You know, I think that's that is what is expected, right? That we sugarcoat it so that it pleases to the majority. So no, like you can't expect things to be like sugarcoated all the time as well. Yeah.
Your question?
Oh, my question. Okay. I guess we can move on from Brownness Redacted, because obviously we don't want to talk about just race, right? I mean, we don't want to pigeonhole you guys. So I think for Christian, something I was really interested about while reading your bio is your interest in masculinity and male allyship. Okay, so I think something really worrying for me is the rise of figures like Andrew Tate. So, I mean, how can we fight toxic masculinity, and perhaps could you share about the attitudes towards masculinity perhaps in the brown community? Like, is it different from how it is in the Chinese community, for example?
You must be high valued men.
Andrew Tate, yeah. Sure, I think it is, you know, I mean, sure. I mean, I know my bio talks about like community discussions and things like that, and obviously that's important, right? This idea of education, but I think I'm personally not necessarily convinced about like sort of like the like quote unquote politics of education. I remember reading this one like blog post that my friend shared about, which was not directly related to Singapore, but they shared it in reference to when Priti and Subhash had made the video, and then how then I think. I guess what they were trying to say from the video, and this person shared this article which was, I think, in reference to BLM specifically, but this idea of like the limits to like the politics of education. And what it means is that like we say a lot that we must educate ourselves, like education is the way forward, which is not false, but it's also just like there is like sort of like inherent or built into that is this idea of it being for the future, right? If we're educating like future generations, or if we're educating ourselves, it's not necessarily like nothing is really being solved right now. So I wouldn't necessarily just say like, we should educate men. Of course we should, but like that's not the thing that I would say we should do. That's just sort of like the default thing. I would say like, again, this is going back to like solutions and what the individual can do in Singapore. And I think we should think a lot about the kinds of institutions that uphold specific kinds of masculinities, right? I guess I am thinking about national service, for example, and even though I have like specific views about national service, I think it is worth thinking about how that institution upholds certain kinds of masculinity, for example. And then as an individual, what can you do to actively challenge the current definition of national service, for example? I mean, obviously there are different institutions, but so I would say as a society, it's worth us re-examining also these kinds of places where like very specific kind of like masculinity is constructed and socialized, because that has such deep implications to then what you think of as success, what you think of as like a successful man, what you think of as, of like successful leadership, that really like bleeds into like the rest of your life. So I guess that's what I would say. I think parents really do need to do a lot more work. I guess especially like fathers, in terms of what does it mean to be a loving or tender father, is something that I think people should ask. I mean, I still hear a lot of anecdotes from like the office and things like that, where like of like young dads being like, oh yeah, my son can't wear pink, and it's really like, yo, y'all are like millennials, you're not boomers. Like, what's happening? Why you still have this view? So I think like people really just need to like step up and really like be good like parental figures, and really, really like do that work of trying to like shed that. You want to talk about brown masculinity? I feel like you explore it in like Brown and Saara.
It's very interesting, because I feel like as brown woman, you're caught in the middle. On one hand, you're like fighting patriarchy in your own community, right? Doesn't help. Andrew Tate is apparently now Muslim, I'm sorry, God. Seriously, apparently, he's like, he starts quoting the Quran and like, okay, sure bro, like, okay. And I think patriarchy I can only talk about the Malay community, right? Like, patriarchy in the Malay Muslim community has been something that Malay women have been fighting for like the longest of time. And then you face Chinese women who apparently come to you and you're like, I met one Malay guy, and they start sprouting like things that are pretty racist, and then you have to defend the men in your community, right? Or like a Chinese woman who date brown women, and they're like, I don't want to date any more Chinese men. I think sometimes you have to acknowledge how brown women treat Chinese women is very different from how they treat us brown women also. So there's many layers to it, Ultimately, what I would say when you talk about like masculinity in the brown community is listen to the brown woman. Listen to the brown woman. We know best. We know best, right? Because we deal with them from birth, right? And I'm the only daughter of like in my parents, like in the family, and there's a lot of things that I would have to fight. But of course, I think I'm pretty lucky because my parents are pretty much, you can do whatever you want, and you can travel, we're not gonna like bother you. But of course, there are things that I would like argue with them like on a daily basis. And I have two brothers, So I feel like when we talk about like brown masculinity, you know, understand that it's not like one thing, right? Like people always attribute it to culture or religion, you know, but it's not always that straightforward, you know, because how we are like is also determined by, I think what Chris mentioned earlier was, you know, like structures, right? You know, a lot of brown men are still, there's still a lot of barriers, you know, to for brown men, you know, when they face, because I know that in the eyes of the Chinese majority, I'm that educated, successful Malay woman, right? Even if they don't agree with what I say, because by default they see me as successful, like, okay, we're not gonna like really fight her, or they think it's okay, or they think that, you know, because she's successful, you know, she is gonna trash the people in her community. It's just not true, right? You know, I've gotten in so many like Grab rides where the Chinese drivers are like, yeah, a lot of Malay men take drugs, a lot of Malay men this, a lot of Malay men that. It's not something that it's very blatantly racism, and as a woman, I don't appreciate that as well as a brown woman, because you're making me do the effort or put a label of explaining to you why that is racist, you know, and I think that when brown women say like just don't, you know, there's certain fights or battles in our community that we like to like keep it to our community because it's so complex, and we don't expect people from the majority to like fight it, but also acknowledge that before you make such sentiments about the men in the community, understand that the men, you know, when you put racial structures, you know, like I think some researchers have said where, you know, when there's barriers to them progressing, to put it like, you know, for lack of better words, the victims or the people who feel it the most are the women in the community. They're not gonna like, they don't have the space to kind of like lash out, right, to the majority. They can't do that. So it's the women who get the brunt of it. So, you know, sometimes I know people in the community talk about it, people outside the community, talk about it, but ultimately how they talk about it hurt us as well, you know. So I think when we address like brown masculinity, I think I'm going around, but like going around in circles, but ultimately just listen to us, you know, and we'll tell you what, you know, you should be concerned about, or what you should just leave it to us, you know, because you don't want to be the reason why Malay women or Indian women have to do the effort of like defending the men in our community because what you say hurt us.
I think, something that I add also is that like what Mysara said, I don't think this is specific to like the, you know, non-Chinese communities, but like I guess in minority communities especially, right, sort of like the attempt to sort of prove your worth or to sort of transcend your brownness comes at the expense of like brown women, right? Like it is the tactic becomes like incredibly like misogynistic, and I think this is something that our other co-editor actually explores in his script in Brown Boys Don't Tell Jokes, where, you know, like there are these brown guys who are trying to fit into like, you know, this group of like in their orientation group with like these other Chinese guys, and they're all joking, right, and they're making racist jokes about a brown woman, and that definitely like I think happens. I've definitely experienced it, and like it definitely keeps happening, right? The idea that in order to sort of try and prove your worth, especially in like a majority community, you put like others down, and oftentimes that is that comes out in like misogynistic ways in putting down like brown women. So like in the lead up to Brownness Haram, like I did these discussions on like brown masculinity, right? The sort of holding on to like privilege of being a man, but then also like in some instances like your brownness then coming into play. It's so interesting like hearing people admit these things, right, that they themselves obviously have been, you know, at times in their lives been like misogynistic, you know, have been homophobic, right, but that also comes from a very like specific place of wanting to feel like they're one of the bros, or like one of the like they fit in with like the Chinese bros, right? Like of course it is inexcusable, but like it also comes from a very certain place, very certain like form of like self-loathing, very certain form of like desire to be accepted also.
And ultimately, that's a human thing, not like something that's specific to a race, right? Just
Sure.
something that I also picked up in, I think, one of the essays about how you should like pathologize certain social issues, like for example, the diabetes, right? I think that's so much more useful to think in terms of, like, for example, class or access to healthcare, as opposed to, just using the CMIO model and conveniently labeling things. And I think that also applies to what we have mentioned when it comes to brown masculinity, because it's not something specific to the brown community. It's just the very fact that they so happen to be the minority in this country, and so then that extra layer makes it harder for them.
I mean, I also think like this idea of brown masculinity also, it falls into how we see brown people, right? We see the, whether it's you see that Chinese woman moving away from her MRT seat when an Indian woman, a man sit like next to her and things like that, because you already have that perception of the violent brown man, or that you should be afraid of because that's what your parents told you when you were growing up, right? I mean, I think last year there was this whole saga that went viral. This designer, she went on like I think it was like a panel, and she was saying that she designs cheongsams because she thinks Chinese women are more progressive than Malay and Indian women. And the example that she gave was like Chinese women were the first to want to shake hands with like white men. So to me, or men in general, like to me that was quite hilarious, because ultimately you can, you are still framing your idea of success through the lens of men. Isn't that patriarchy, right? And also this idea that, of course there's, internally there's this whole discussion that we have within like the Malay Muslim community, but, understanding that Malay and Indian women, we have our own agency as well is important, because I think, when you talk a lot about brown masculinity, we immediately assume that every brown man out there is patriarchal, right?
Yeah, sure.
And then every Chinese man out there is progressive. I beg to disagree. In fact, I strongly disagree, right? I think that harms women in general, right? This idea that only brown men are patriarchal, only Chinese men are progressive, because I've gotten a lot of sexist and sexualized comments from Chinese men as well. And I think, once you understand that, yes, the women in the community are fighting this idea of like patriarchy in their own community, but doesn't mean that they don't have their own agency, then I think we can talk about like progress, right? Because you see a woman covered up, you immediately assume that she's oppressed by her religion or her community. At the end of the day, like, you're still not letting women decide how they want to dress.
Just speaking on behalf of
just speaking on behalf of them. Like, I'm gonna like defend my right to not like cover my hair, but I'm also gonna defend a woman trying to cover her hair. You telling me like, wow, this is so bad, like they cover the hair. I'm like, no, like just stop talking, right? That's not it, right? That's not it. So I think that's also very important. Like, how do we see the men and women in the minority communities, right? The brown woman that needs saving is not like a sentiment that I want to hear as well. Yeah,
I think what you say about, sometimes being made by majority groups to sort of like, or sometimes being pit against, members of your own race or your own community, right? You're told, you're not like one of them, right? Or don't you agree with me? They're like that, but you are not like that. It's a very uncomfortable position to be in.
Also, like, even like when you see a brown woman being very outspoken, people are like, wow, where did you get that from? I'm like, it's like, if you see societies around the region, we have very matriarchal societies. My granddad comes from like West Sumatra. It's a matriarchal society.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say actually. I feel like Malay societies tend to be quite matriarchal, and they're quite respectful.
I mean, there is like patriarchy, definitely. There's patriarchy everywhere. But I think to only attribute it to us is very problematic. It doesn't help anything. Doesn't help women actually. To just attribute it to race. It's a very lazy way actually of talking about patriarchy in the country.
So, Mysara, you're currently doing Malay Studies Masters, right? Maybe you can share a bit with us about what interests you or fascinates you about Malay studies. Like I've actually got a classmate who's doing MLL for A-levels, Malay Language and Literature, you know.
Right.
And she's doing a research project this year on, I'm not really sure what her topic is, but you know, every week she goes to NUS.
Yep.
And she has access to all the Malay Malay Studies department's resources.
Yeah.
You know, and every week she's like, I'm learning so much about like my community, which is a community that she's very involved in.
Yes.
So, but I think it's not really something that a lot of people know much about otherwise. Maybe.
What attracted me was I applied for this program when I was still working as like a producer, right? With Channel News Asia, and I realized that the media, especially whether it's talking about Malay media or English media, when we talk about community issues, it's very surface level. It's like, oh, this is happening. Like I think there was an article like, 48% of men, Malay men are in prison for like drugs, but it doesn't really address the issue, right?
Yeah.
And unless you're really deep in the circle, you won't really understand, which leads to like people in the community internalizing, very racist sentiments about your own self.
Yeah.
I found out about the Malay Studies department. I was interested through friends who also studied there. I wanted to kind of break away from this narrative, but also find a department that really understands it. I don't think frankly, I don't feel there's any perfect department to study. There's always I think rooms that can be improved in every department. But I felt like Malay Studies was a very good start to understanding it, right? It gives you access. A lot of people think you study the Malay language, but it's not. It's a multidisciplinary faculty, so it's like history, politics, culture, language, literature, art, and it gives you, I think, the basic understanding of the Malay community here, but also the bigger region. So that includes Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Philippines as well, right? And I think it definitely gave me a lot of insight and eye-opening knowledge to thinkers around the region, because a lot of these are often not I think seeked out, especially by Singaporean students, right?
Yeah.
When you talk about social sciences, you think about the same white men, right? All white men, and that's it, right? But what about thinkers from the region, right? We want to understand about this, where this narrative of lazy Malays come from. Syed Hussein Alatas, right? Is that in the myth of the lazy native? You have scholars like Lily Zubaida Rahim, who is a niece of Yusuf Ishak, who wrote I feel it's a holy Bible of Malay studies, which is the Singapore Dilemma. It really goes into it, right? So there's all this knowledge out there that basically explains what we are trying to do, but because it's not huge, it's not a big department like sociology or political science or IR that everyone wants to take, it's often forgotten, right? You assume that it's not really important, but I mean, if you're gonna be living in Singapore, if you're Singaporean, I think understanding that is very important, right? Yeah.
I think that's really important because it's so ironic that we know more about European history than the history of our own region.
Yes,
I really dislike that.
Yes, right. I think it's also a way to break away from, I think, how we behave in Southeast Asia. I believe in Singaporeans getting bullied by people in Southeast Asia, to be honest. Sometimes we deserve that slander. Right? You talk about Indonesia, people think it's just Bali, right? Or Jakarta or whatever, and that's it. When it's a bigger region, Indonesia and Malaysia is not homogeneous. Even when we talk about the Malays in Malaysia, it's not homogeneous. And I think personally for me, I think when I write my pieces, I do see how people talk about, because it's Singapore is I guess the opposite, right? We are the minorities, but I know when I'm in Malaysia or Indonesia, I'm okay, I don't really have to think about race, right? But also how they talk about it, it's okay, there are things that I don't want to repeat in my community and things like that. So it breaks away from this very privileged Singaporean mindset.
Coming from a more literary perspective, right? Is there something more like, is there a defining trait about Malay literature as compared to Western literature? Because I think my impression is that, at least for modern Western literature, they're quite obsessed with the idea of individuality, like this work is attributed to this individual. Whereas I feel like in Malay literature, there's this emphasis on like community aspect, and like some works are literally just anonymous works. I think like recently, I think one of our poetry readers read this anonymous proverb that she says quite popular in the community, like something about how yang merah itu saga and then yang indah itu bahasa, right? And then like these you don't get these anonymous like poems in like in Western culture. So is that something defining for literature?
I do agree in some sense. I'm not like a Malay literature expert. I have to make that like clear. I haven't sat here for like Dr. Azhar's class enough to talk about it. But I think Malay literature, for me at least, the way I see it has always been the way it's written, right? When I talk about Malay literature, I'm talking about the bigger region as well, right? It has always had this way of talking about community or critiquing about community. And these are coming from like, what we would call Islamic scholars as well. And then sometimes they write, you'd be like, wow, like you wouldn't expect that coming from a male Islamic scholar. And these are men who write about, or critiquing, how women are treated in society. Like you don't see that much anymore, but like at that point of time back then, like you had a lot of that literature. There is a piece of literature that I think changed my life forever. Like it's a piece from this Indonesian writer who critiques. So he's from like the Minangkabau society, where community where, like along my standard family is from, and there's a lot of writers there. And there's even a city there that's like known as like the writer city. Like a lot of the big writers are from there, and they are, even though people think of them and they are quite conservative Islamic society, there are a lot of like literature that critiques how people view religion, and the way they write it is to me incredible, because you don't really see that kind of writing anymore. It's very sharp, where like there is that particular literature, Robohnya surau kami, which translates to the demolish of our suraus, or like small place like prayer spaces. So it's a critique about how sometimes this very fatalistic idea of religion in the society. We leave everything to God. I don't have to work. I don't have to do anything. I just pray to God. But essentially, he writes about how that's not what religion is, right? And I think that I feel like is defining of Malay literature in that sense, right? It's finding that like very unique voice to kind of critique it. It doesn't have to be straightforward, sometimes it's sharp, and it's meant to be sharp. So I think that is what I love about like Malay literature. You can't, the thing about translating it gets lost. The essence of it is lost.
I think we've overshot our allotted 1 hour by quite a bit. But maybe just to end things off, I'll ask both of you, what comes next? I know both of you have said you don't want to be defined as co-editor of Brown is Redacted. So besides having co-editor of Brown is Redacted, what next to your name? What else is there? What are you working on right now? What comes next?
I just have to finish my thesis. It's been a long time, honestly, I'm looking forward to like a good break. I did my first exhibition in Jakarta this year, and that was really, really interesting. And I'm hoping to kind of like expand my works out of Singapore, personally. But also I think, essentially break away from like race-related work, I would love to ultimately do more works revolving around like Malay women and this idea of femininity in the community as well. And I haven't really thought about like how I'm going to go into that, but that is definitely a topic that I'm interested in like looking at, also I think looking at the region really interests me as well, especially with my frequent trips around the region. I'm like, it's very interesting how people in the region see the Malay community. Sometimes they forget that we exist, or like they don't really know much about us, right? So it's like, like to kind of bring this, like all these books to the region.
Yeah, I think apart from Brownness Redacted, so we're also going to go down to obviously Jakarta to do a talk actually in Jakarta about Brownness Redacted. But beyond that, I think I am interested in. I mean, obviously, as it says in my bio, I guess I identify as an activist and do a lot of things, I guess, in Singapore. So I am interested also in like writing about activism. And so that's definitely something that like, I guess, I'm thinking about. Obviously with Ethos Books, there is something coming up next year, I guess, that I'm writing for on behalf of like SG Climate Rally. So I think that's interesting. I also have a few things coming up with like other publications like Jom that will be coming out soon. And then like a shameless plug that SG Climate Rally will be having another physical rally this year. So I think a lot of my time, at least in the second half of the year, will be preoccupied with that. Another thing to note is that our other contributor, Malay has his book coming out with Ethos in June called Cat Skull. It's like a neo-noir crime thriller set in Singapore.
Sounds really cool.
Oh, you can edit this part out also. I've only read one neo-noir crime thriller set in Singapore and it sucked.
Okay.
So,
I won't edit this
The bar is low.
That's true.
Can only go up from here.
So that sounds interesting. I'll check it out. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much to Kristian and Mysara from Brownness Redacted for coming down to SLS today and agreeing to take part in this interview. I really enjoyed hearing what you had to say, and I really enjoyed reading your book as well. I think it speaks to the experiences of many, many, many people in Singapore.
Not just from the brown community.
Not just from the brown community, I think it speaks to experiences of, feeling alienated or othered in all sorts of ways. Thank you. Sorry.
Do you want to like
How do you
plug your stuff?
Remember to follow us on Instagram at SplooshSG and follow our podcast for more.
Golden Mile open call, we pay, so you can submit in Thai or English. What else? Next show, 27th of May at Crane. Yep, I don't know.
Right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please share it with your friends. It means a lot to us. Also, share with us your thoughts by reaching out to us on Instagram at sploosh_SG. Or if you have other people in mind whom you want us to interview, simply let us know. Until then, take care.